Thanks so much for joining us today. We are here to have a really great conversation around AI and responsible use of AI. I'm going to start. I'm Tracy Frey. I'm the Director of Strategy for Cloud AI. I'm going to start with just a few slides, a little bit of history, a little bit of future, a little bit of everything. Before we then have a conversation, I also just want to make sure I introduce our fabulous panel that we have today. So we have David Knott, who is Chief Architect at HSBC, Jay Yagnik, who's a VP at Google AI and Fellow. And then we have Nick McGuire, who is the Vice President and Head of Enterprise Research at CCS Insight. So you're going to be hearing more from them in just a couple seconds. So I wanted to start because part of a question that I get all the time is around how come the mixing of things like ethics and technology. And the reality is these things have been mixed for quite a long time, really since its inception, because the story of AI actually doesn't start with technology at all. The story of AI really starts with philosophy, with thinkers like Lull and Hobbes and Descartes, all of whom really wanted to apply order to thinking. You can see Descartes really wanted thought to be as systematic as something like algebra or geometry. And there was this vision that in the future, machines could help with this sort of ordered thinking. You could see some of this actually in where we take inspiration from biology. And this is really the basis of neural networks, is in fact the neurons in our brain. This diagram shows how the neurons in the brain, and they send out all their signals through the dendrites. Those are sensors, right? This was inspiration in many ways for the Turing machine. Which is a interesting concept if you're not really thinking about how some of these things come together to really make AI what it is today. From the 1950s into the mid-70s, right around my birth time, we had the both hyped AI winter. So this is an image of the perceptron that was built in 1958. What you can't see in this screen is a 2020 array of camera lenses. And this was, these were the camera lenses were meant to be the eyes. This thing got so hot that you could fry an egg on it. It was larger than a Sub-Zero refrigerator. But it didn't work. The goal here was to create a machine that could perceive something. You could show it an image of something, and it could then tell you what that image was. Because this didn't work, there was then really no funding for neural networks for almost 10 years. This started to change in the 80s with new advances in physics and math, folks like Geoff Hinton, who's now at Google, and really understanding things like backpropagation. And this really started to change the game and bring us to where we are today and what might be possible with AI today. In the 1990s up through the 2000s, the big change that happened was a massive improvement in computing power. So everyone here has probably heard of Moore's Law. What's crazy here is that it really just continues, and we're actually going to talk about that in a moment, and how that is specific to machine learning. One of the things that computing power has enabled is for the technology to get far more sophisticated. So in 2011, the field of computer vision had about a 26% error rate. In contrast, humans had about a 5% error rate. Fast forward just 5 years to 2016, and at that point, computer vision has a 3% error rate. In many ways, more capability than the human eye. That is a massive change in a very short time period. And this brings us in many ways to where we are today, where AI is now capable of doing so many things, and that makes it even more important that we spend the time to really think about how we are going to use it in our organizations. When I think about the rise of the internet and how much that changed everybody's lives. And I went to college at a time when the internet didn't exist. And if I think about trying to do that again now, it is pretty much impossible. And when I think about what I've seen from what AI can do for enterprises, for consumers, for the world at large, we really are on the cusp of something very, very similar. Coming back to Moore's Law for a second, there are over 90 machine learning papers published per day. It is outpacing Moore's Law. So the capabilities here are growing at an enormously rapid clip. And that's been the case for Google as well. So over that time period of the last 5 to 7 years, Google has really transformed itself into an AI-first company, which is something you hear from us a lot about how we see the world. It is really now infused in almost every part of Google's business and has made some of our most powerful technologies that everybody most enjoys possible because of how much machine learning has become a part of what they do. AI has incredible capabilities to do phenomenal things for the world. Some of my favorite examples are things like being able to find manatees, sea cows, from a very high altitude. And if you've had the chance to look at what some of those images actually look like when you're taking a picture of the ocean, it's impossible to spot that manatee, and yet machine learning can do that. This example in the top in the middle is of a group of Japanese farmers who created a cucumber sorter using TensorFlow. So this is not limited to the world of enterprises who can hire data scientists. It is really available to everybody, and this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about in Cloud AI, and something that we're really excited about. The more products we offer, the more enterprises who work with us, and the more that we can really do with companies around the world. AI has the potential to really help humans make more responsible decisions. So in 2015, this is an ongoing partnership, but this example is from 2015 specifically. We worked with the Gina Davis Institute. We reviewed 200 films and analyzed them for both speaking and screen time for men and women. Really interesting things came out of that study. The first is that women-led films made 16% more at the box office, and yet men were both seen and heard twice as much as women on screen. So you can think about how this can help really drive responsible decisions and create better business value for organizations, because those organizations could be making significantly more value should they have better equality. And that would then help set the stage for everybody to have the potential to see themselves in the future in media. Sometimes issues with bias in machine learning can really also help highlight how bias can be quite systemic. So this study was of 3 million English words from public news sites, from Google News, and it generated he-she analogies. So for example, if you were to use, if I were to say to you, Paris is to France as Tokyo is to Japan. And if I said king is to man as queen is to, right. So you would expect to hear Japan, you would expect to hear woman. And this is measured by the distance between words. And so what this study did was it looked at those distance between words and then applied he-she analogies to those. So for example, you would say she is to sewing as he is to, and the answer that comes back is carpentry. She is to housewife as he is to shopkeeper. She is to nurse as he is to surgeon. So this can really help show just how pervasive and systemic some of those biases are. And that gives us the ability to take a look at that and say, okay, that's not exactly what we mean. How do we fix that? One of the challenges with machine learning is that these mistakes, if they happen, can propagate very, very quickly. So if, for example, in these two images at the top, it's not perceptible to the human eye, but when you mislabel it as a fish, you can see what happens, that suddenly then all of these images of dogs get labeled as fish instead. And these are the kinds of things that if a mistake like that happens, it can happen at great scale and with great speed. And so it's very important to be cautious. Part of my job for Cloud AI is to look after the process we've built to support building our products in alignment with the Google AI principles. The rest of my job is around how can we make Cloud AI successful? And that's around how can we make it so that enterprises around the world really love our products and want to use them over and over and over again. I see these two things as intimately tied, because really, when AI is going to be successful, it's because it's going to be trusted. And in order for it to be trusted, it has to be trusted by organizations, by their employees, and by all of their customers. And so for me, a large part of what is going to make AI successful for any organization is when it's responsible. Last year, Google released our AI principles, this set of 7 things that we believe AI should do, and 4 areas that are applications that we said we would not pursue ourselves. And this is something that we spend an enormous amount of time really diving into on a regular basis and ensuring that all of our products are built in such a way that they are fulfilling as much of this mission as we can. And we spend time together looking at all the different things we can pull in to ensure that we have alignment with the AI principles in the products that we offer. Some things that we think a lot about when we talk to customers are around taking a human-centered design approach, and we have a number of resources available for how we might do that. We talk a lot about how important it is to really know your training data, and not just what's in the data, but to be thinking outside that, around the sociological effects, around some of those systemic issues, because without thinking about what is showing up in the data before it even gets into your systems, it's impossible to really be thinking about unfair bias in a way that is really robust. In order to help with that, having interpretability and explainability, making sure that machine learning can be understood, both what's in the data and the decisions that it's making. And this is an area where we're spending a lot of time. You can see some of the outcome of this. This was an example from Google Translate with Turkish, where instead of making an assumption that he is the one who is the doctor, offering different options between he and she. But even this is something that is not enough, because that is not a gender-neutral experience. And so how do we then expand on what we're already doing as we learn more? Because the reality is, this is not something that anybody can get 100% right. This is something that we all do everything that we can, and we learn as we go. And we are always learning from our customers, from our consumers, from each other, from all of the exciting research that's available. This you can see also in something like Smart Compose, where, again, some of those systemic biases showed up. So an internal research scientist discovered that when typing, "I am meeting an investor next week," the next suggestion was, "Do you want to meet him?" And so instead of making that assumption for somebody in Smart Compose doesn't use gender-based pronouns in their suggestions at all. And until we are in a situation where we may be able to actually accurately predict exactly what that person is intending, that is something that would remain. Biases in data can come from a number of different sources. They can come from biased data distribution, from representation, and from labels. These are all things that are really, really important to take into consideration as you are building and deploying machine learning models. One of the things that we've made available is the What If tool that allows you, and we won't show this video here today, but I encourage everybody to find it online. But this allows you to take different viewpoints and understand how a model is reacting from different characteristics. as we built our governance process in cloud around how we want to support the AI principles, there were a number of things that were really important to us to ensure that we built for. And one thing that's not listed on here, but is actually extraordinarily important, is that it shouldn't be dependent on the people who are currently undertaking this process. So for me, it's very important that this is something that lives on at Google because it is rigorous enough that it doesn't require me or the folks who are currently in Cloud AI in order to know how to go about doing it. So it was really important for us that it be very, very rigorous, engaging, that it's efficient. We're all very busy. We want to make sure it's a good use of everybody's time, and so that when we have the conversations, everybody has done all of their homework already and is ready to sit down and discuss what's at hand. That they're effective, that it leads to tangible outcomes and improvements in our products, and that they're balanced in understanding both the needs that are out there as well as the requirements of any business. We talk a lot about how technology is most powerful when everyone can use it, but really at the end of the day, it's even more powerful when everyone can benefit from it. And this is the vision that we are trying to accomplish within Cloud AI. And with that, I would like to turn it over. We're going to have a discussion with these folks here. So sit back down. I'd like to start with both David and Nick. As Jay and I were talking about this panel and preparing for it, Jay had an excellent question, which is that, from within Google, we are experiencing AI from the demand we hear from customers. And it would be great to get a sense from both of you about the on-the-ground reality. What is it like to be experiencing the AI wave happening, both from within an organization and from an analyst perspective?
Okay, so thanks very much, Tracy. So I think the way I reflect on it is to say that I think we experience it at HSBC as a large traditional bank somewhat differently than you experience it in Google. We don't do original research to develop new ground-up technology for AI. So we're a consumer rather than an inventor. What I'd say is that consumption is kind of turning up to us in three ways at the moment. Firstly, it's turning up through platforms like Google Cloud Platform. So that has done a huge amount to enable us to have a place where we can put data, operate on it at scale, and have access to a bunch of trainable models through APIs that dramatically lower the bar for us in terms of skills and capability. I think that the way I tend to think of about 10 years ago, we would have had to hire a bunch of PhDs. 6 or 7 years ago, we would have had to hire the PhD students. 4 or 5 years ago, we would have had to hire really red-hot, world-class AI engineers, and now we can retrain our developers and engineers to consume AI and build from scratch. So the cloud platforms are making a huge difference to us. The other two categories we're seeing, though, are we seeing, apologies to any sales guys in the room.
There's none here, right?
Yeah, there's no salespeople here,
Just to be sure.
I get sold a lot too. So as chief architect of the bank, I get to make some choices about what we buy and what we don't buy. So lots of people want to sell things to me. I'm seeing a phrase that I learned from Nick a little while ago: AI washing, AI toothbrushing, where products that have got some degree of modeling or analytics in there have kind of had the AI label stuck across them. And if you are selling that, please stop doing that. If you have real AI built into your platform, I'm all ears, but please make it real. So I'm seeing, and I think that's indicative of there being some hype in the marketplace right now. Then the third category I'm seeing is our direct engineering consumption of open source frameworks. I think our perception is still that there's been a huge advance in the platform space, places we can come and build models, test models, validate models, consume AI. I think the domain-specific space, solutions that are specific to financial services, is still quite thin. So we're having to build that ourselves. We don't mind building it ourselves. Again, if you're out there and you're a product company and you want to do something interesting, then solving a bunch of problems in financial services and bringing them to us as consumable solutions would be great. And then my final thought is that I still think we have a big, I'd say we have two problems. One's an education problem and one's an imagination problem. The education problem is, I think, that for most people in large enterprises that, again, are different demographic to Google. In Google, you're mostly engineers and technical people, people with a technical background, and people who don't understand AI will feel compelled to find out what it actually means technically on the ground. Most of the people working for our company aren't technical people and don't necessarily have the propensity or the skills to go deep into what the technology actually means. So AI is just a term, and they will see what happens in the press or what gets presented to them as salespeople. So it's a pretty vague term that could mean a lot of things. So grounding, for our people to ground themselves in what it actually means and what it could do for our company is an education problem. The other problem is the imagination problem, where I think actually quite often people, when you explain to them what the current generation of AI really is, they feel slightly disappointed. It's like the magic's gone away. It's not some big brain in the cloud. There's models and algorithms and data, and there's still hard work to be done. So then the imagination comes in, which is actually, well, how do you put together that core predictive capability and use it to solve business problems? So we're tackling both those things, but I think it's still really early days. We are enormously excited about the potential. Our space, banks are all about data. Our space is a rich opportunity space for deployment of AI. We're really just getting started.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating listening to David speak. First of all, thank you very much for having me on the panel. I'm privileged in the sense as a research analyst, I get to sit in between the kind of maelstrom of customer requirements and researching customers and speaking to customers around AI and ML on a regular basis. We also do quite a lot of survey work as well, get up to 700-800 companies across Europe and the US every year. And we also look at employee attitudes as well. So we can kind of cover that space, but we also sit in between the big cloud companies and have their views of the universe. And really settling all that down is really kind of speaks a little bit to what David was saying. I mean, what we see out there, first of all, is that our statistics tell us anywhere between kind of 60 and 70% of large businesses that we survey around usage of AI and ML have some form of project, research, or proof of concept. These types of, actually a percentage of them are actually in production grade with certain applications as well. So, and we've seen that grow quite substantially over the last couple of years. So there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of thirst for knowledge and there's a lot of gravity, obviously, and many of you here in the room will attest to this around AI and ML at the moment. But I would classify the market as still very experimental. We see a lot of companies that are just starting to learn. They're starting on small projects. They're picking use cases where they can kind of start small, get quick wins, iterate and learn and go beyond into that arena. But what we're starting to hear more of, though, are companies saying, look, how do we take these kind of small experimental engagements and how do we think about a world where we've actually embedded machine learning capabilities into our organization, into many business processes? And that's maturing the requirements that we're seeing. In the last 12 months in particular, when we ask customers, okay, what are your real barriers and requirements for AI inside your organization? And 12 months ago, we heard a lot around, to the point that David's making, we heard skills, challenges, we heard, make the tools simple. We heard use cases, like I want to be able to apply this to my business. We heard data problems in terms of preparatory work and so forth. Those challenges are still there, but what we're now starting to see are companies asking questions about risk. And a lot of the questions and a lot of the points that Tracy was raising are bringing up questions around, okay, how do I address security? How do I handle compliance in a world where this is embedded into my operational processes? And I think most of all, probably the top question we're hearing now in the industry, and I think the hyperscale cloud companies are coming to this now, is around transparency and explainability. How do I lower my dependency on black box AI? And how do I actually create and have instrumentation into my tools that allow me to start to think about how I build interpretability? And more importantly, to David's point, it's not necessarily about interpretability to the data science teams or to the developer teams, which obviously are leading projects at the moment. It's more about the business. How do I get the business engaged in supporting the technology? And I think those are the questions that companies are grappling with now, which is slightly different than say 12 to 18 months ago.
It's interesting with that. One of the things that's making me think about is we talk a lot about how because AI has really only been able to be used by a relatively small part of the population for the last 60 years, that's created a situation where there are really a lack of enterprise examples, because organizations that have been able to leverage AI can do that because they've been able to hire in that scarce talent. And then it becomes something where it's very proprietary, and so nobody who's on the outside, because those solutions have been built bespoke in-house, has any sense of exactly what's happening. And in hearing you talk, I'm thinking about how that's actually now the experience, both at a macro and at a micro level. And it's making the requirements and need for AI to be far more explainable even more important, because you need to be able, now that you can start to understand how to use it, if you're still unable to understand what it's doing and how it's doing it, and if it's doing it in a way that you feel after you've assessed is rigorously ethical and is being deployed responsibly, if you can't understand those things, how can you trust it? So to Jay, you've been at Google for 14 years, and I would love to hear, and I imagine others would love to hear as well, how have you seen machine learning change over that time, and particularly with regards to issues of fairness and bias?
Sure, happy to talk about that. A little apology in advance. I've come down with a little bit of a cough. Perfect day to have it, when you're speaking with an audience. So if there are brief interruptions, apologies.
If only there were a robot that could speak for Jay or something.
Don't make them laugh.
Yeah,
Don't
sorry.
make them-
We were just joking about this earlier. Back when I joined Google about 14 years ago, we could actually fit everyone in the company who had some background or spoke machine learning, AI, computer vision, pattern recognition in a room much, much smaller than the room like this. Right? So it's been great to see that journey, and I kind of compare it to phases of technology adoption. There are various models out there, but all of them roughly fall in this 4 or 5 phase categorization, which is that you have an early adopters phase, followed by late adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggers, right? And they follow this kind of a normal curve of sorts. And when you are in the early adoption phase, the kind of questions that get asked, the kind of projects that people find exciting is very different than the phase after that and the phase after that. And this has been historically true for almost all the fields, and I think machine learning is no exception in that regard. Back at Google, whenever we used to have leadership gatherings, I remember a decade ago, people would walk up to me and their favorite question would be, when would computer vision work for real, or name your subfield of AI, and sorry, when would that become real? And then starting a few years ago, when people walk up to me in these gatherings, they usually come up and say, here's Google Photos, it misclassified this picture, it didn't catch the dog. Right? And to me, looking at a 10-year period and how the nature of the question changes is actually a really good reflection on what's happened in the field underneath. Right? Is that we effectively went from taking this as maybe it will work someday, sounds interesting, intellectually curious, to as you enter into the kind of late adopters, early majority side, right? This question about quality, reliability, security, fairness, transparency, all of these things, it seems like they come out of the blue, but actually no, they're completely expected with regards to the adoption curve here. And at Google, we have tried to anticipate a lot of this. The reason we came up with AI principles is we felt that as an organization that was in some way leading the way in this field, that what we set out as the kind of operating principles as well as what we draw awareness to will have transitive effect kind of elsewhere. And if you look at different aspects of the principles, we draw out things that we feel we really have to make progress on in order to make this early majority, late majority part of the curve, right? Which means that AI and machine learning will gradually start to become critical part of societal processes, like be it companies, be it governance, decision making, and so forth. And there all of these things become really important. And that also explains why if you look at ML fairness, it almost didn't exist as a field 10 years ago. Right? And it started to become a field 5 years ago, and it's kind of rapidly on the rise. And I fully expect that about 4 or 5 years from now, it will be a big field with a kind of more mature cadence of its own. So that's kind of the long-term view of things that we see.
Great. So, David, something that many people may not know about you is that you have a background in philosophy and a PhD in ethics.
Yes.
Can you talk about how the combination of technology and philosophy has helped both your thinking about ethical implications of AI and then how that's impacted HSBC?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think if I follow Jay's lead and say probably the number of people who've studied ethics academically and studied AI could probably fit in a much smaller room than this.
Absolutely.
There's probably a phone booth outside somewhere we could all have a convention in. So I think the way it's impacted my perspective is that it brings to me probably two concerns and a hope. So my first concern is that, you know, you showed your graph of the speed at which AI is developing, you know, the Moore's law curve. Philosophy does not move on that curve. In case anyone knows, you know, most of philosophy is having arguments with dead people who framed their arguments over 2,000 years ago. So, you know, I regularly have arguments with Aristotle. So that is not just, obviously most of us don't live our lives as philosophers, but that's an indicator of the speed with which our general ethical thinking moves. It does not move at the same speed as technology is changing at the moment. So my first fear is that AI and other technologies will outstrip our ability to respond ethically to them. The second fear, and this definitely comes from my background as both a 30-year veteran of doing enterprise technology, background as a software engineer and as a business person, and as a philosopher, is that in engineering and in business and in architecture, which is what I do for a day job, we are problem solvers and solution builders and optimizers, and we look to optimize outcomes. And that's our normal mode of thinking, that's our normal mode of approaching problems. And my belief is that is not the right way to approach ethical problems. It's not actually normally a helpful way. And just to illustrate this, if you indulge me for 30 seconds, there's a famous philosophical problem that gets written about a lot at the moment in the field of AI, and particularly in the field of autonomous cars. Many of you probably heard of it. Who's heard of the trolley problem? Yeah, quite a few people. And again, 10 years ago, probably no hands would have gone up. So those of you who don't know, the trolley problem is remarkable. We're in San Francisco because it's one of the few places in the world where this actually is still the trolley problem.
And the Cable Car Museum is
Yes.
amazing if you haven't gone.
Yeah, because most places don't have trolley cars or cable cars anymore. So the idea is, the thought experiment is, you're in a street, there's a trolley car coming down the street, it's out of control. Further down the street, unaware, are 5 people, and they will get run over and killed by this out of control trolley car. Fortunately, you're standing by a switch, and if you pull the switch, you can divert the car onto another track. But the problem is there's one other person on that other track, and if you divert them, it will definitely kill that other person. Now, normally when you present this problem to engineers, at this point, everybody starts inventing solutions and ways around it, and could I throw myself in front of the car, and blah, blah. So you can't change the thought experiment. You either kill 5 people or you act and kill 1 person. Now, I'm quite pleased the thought experiment is in the wild now, and people are talking about it. My worry is that I think people are approaching it in the wrong way. They're approaching this as an engineering problem. You can see lots of people turning up and go, oh great, okay, I've got this thought experiment now, 5 greater than 1, save 5, kill 1, good, job done, right, now design my autonomous car. Now I just need to know this number is bigger than that number. The point is that's not the point of that thought experiment. The point of the thought experiment is that maximizing is not a simple thing to do. Choosing to pull that lever and kill the other person carries ethical weight. And it's not a simple thing, it's not a straight numbers game. So the thought experiment is designed to express the complexity of ethical thinking, but my worry is that right now it's turning up and people are treating it as if I could just solve this problem, figure out which number is larger than the other, then we can go on and design our models. So that's my second concern. My hope is we're having this conversation. So this is an AI ethics, AI responsibility session, and it's full house. That tells me that people are genuinely engaging with this topic, and engaging with the topic thoughtfully is the first step. To me, the other analogy I have is with unconscious bias training, in helping people to understand diversity and the biases they carry. Unconscious bias training does not remove unconscious bias; it just makes you aware of it. You pretty much can't remove it because it's kind of part of our neurology. ethics training, conversations about AI ethics do not solve all ethical problems, but at least they remind us all those of us, I should imagine a lot of people in this room who are trying to build solutions, that we are operating in a context with ethical weight. You know, the things we choose to do have ethical consequences. So the fact we're having the conversation gives me hope. And then finally, to answer very briefly your question on how's this affecting HSBC. So I've tried to have this, I have had this conversation at HSBC. We have, in developing our own set of ethical principles, been thoughtful about the fact that, you know, the banking equivalent of engineering is kind of compliance. And you could write a set of compliance type rules that people could comply with. And the problem with that is that would treat this as a solved problem and just give people a set of rules they could follow. The point for me is this is not a solved problem by any means. So our principles, the same as the Google principles, are really starting points for engagement and thought. And that, again, that gives me hope. So that's the way we're trying to approach it.
And just to put a point on that, I'm just curious, how many people in the room have tried to create a long list of these are the things that are okay and these are the things that are not okay from a AI and ethics standpoint, right? So it's not a small number of people who've tried to do that because it's very tempting and it's really attractive to have that nice list that can be just a decision tree for your organization. And to your point, it's impossible.
Yep.
And that, so it is about then the conversations that you have and what you do about the conversations that you have and the issues that surface from those conversations and how you apply ethical thinking to those. That's where you can make a difference.
I mean, if I can jump in on that, I mean, one of the things that I am seeing, and it is, to your point, it is an iterative and it's an ongoing conversation, but the ethical question, these are macro kind of societal questions, but down in kind of the traditional enterprise, solving a specific problem with ML, I think when companies start to think about governance to the point that you were talking about, the whole process of principles comes in. And I think one of the things that we've said, and we've seen some companies kind of say, is that, look, if we can start with our company values and we can start to design things based around our, first of all, risk profile,
Right.
you know, and secondly, the values of the organization, that can get us moving into those areas. I think you can get stuck way up here, and I think that is an ongoing discussion that's absolutely critical and fascinating. But the company, you know, principles and values of the organization, that's always a blueprint. It's interesting to see now with yourselves and some of the other technology companies actually putting out their principles, which are linked to their company values, as kind of indication and help for companies doing that as well. So just a thought in terms of how we've seen
I'm now
some companies
worried that
tackle.
you may have sneaked inside our organisation, because we haven't published our principles yet, but actually principle number 1 is act in accordance with our values. Because we're a very strongly values-driven organisation.
Yep.
We said, look, this is novel technology and it raises some novel moral problems, but actually our grounding in our values stays the same. You know,
Yeah.
It's been the same for a very long time and we're not shifting from them. Just have those in mind when you're making choices about how to deploy this new technology.
Yeah, it's
100%.
one of the things we did. I mean, I think Google is quite clear on its core values, and that's something that, you know, we as a group that works within Google feel strongly about. But even as Cloud AI, we took on a process to understand what are the core values of the individuals who work in Cloud AI as an organization, and when we do that, what does that mean? How do they relate then to the core values of Google? And just to ensure that there wasn't any mismatch, which good news, there wasn't. But being able to have that also to then build our own processes on top of was extremely helpful.
Right.
Because it was specific to us
Right.
as a group.
Yeah, I want to add just a couple of
Yeah,
things
please.
based on what I'm hearing. I mean, I really agree with David on the part about not rushing to come to a spec for compliance.
That's right.
Because what the behavior that entails is that it gives us a false sense that we actually know exactly what we are optimizing against.
Right.
And whenever you have a compliance spec, like sorry, any logical system optimization will optimize the system right up to the boundary condition. Right? And then it's a debate on how do you move the boundary conditions. So I think we very much have to treat this as an open, evolving space and don't over-specify in places where we shouldn't.
That's right, which is uncomfortable. That's an uncomfortable
it
space
is.
to be in, where
Yeah.
because there isn't
Yeah.
an end.
Yeah, but I think there is also an opportunity, which is the second part of what I want to say, is that with AI and machine learning entering so many domains, this is the first time that we are going to have a data-driven sense for what the lay of the land is. And I think on equal parts caution, I think there's an equal parts opportunity, where we know that there are things that happen in society that aren't, fair in some, statistical definition of fairness or in congruence with our values, but there is an enforcement gap between the two, which in absence of a data-driven system was really hard to bridge. And I think as AI and machine learning starts to enter these systems, we have a chance to actually make that bridge happen. Right? So I think it's an opportunity in equal parts as well.
So, Nick, you talked earlier about some of the things you're hearing from customers, particularly around explainability and transparency. Is there anything else that you hear that we should all be thinking about that customers are asking around responsible use of AI? Anything that we might be missing or is just really top of mind?
Yeah, I think when we think about AI responsibility, first of all, it is becoming a very important aspect now of thinking within companies. But what I think is coming to is actually organizations having a process for governance and, more importantly, I think quality assurance in terms of not only the technology but the process in terms of building ML-based applications inside the organizations. And those really fall under kind of three key buckets of activity, and two of which are really really important today. I think the first one, of course, is this topic of fairness and designing with principles, right from the beginning. And I think that's still an ongoing challenge. The second one is this point on transparency. And what's good about the notion of explainability is to watch the level of which the technology, and I know this isn't entirely a technology-based discussion, but the work that yourselves at Google are doing, it's going to be fascinating to see, to the point that you made earlier, in 12, 18 months, or sorry, I think it was you, Jay, that made this, that the instrumentation that will be at the disposal of companies when they're building out these applications, that they can actually have interfaces and performance monitoring and user interfaces that can actually help them with a lot of that interpretability into those applications. Now, bear in mind that from what we see is companies don't necessarily think that specific use cases aren't going to have full-scale requirements for explainability, and obviously explainability itself is a subjective topic. But what it means is certainly as companies move to that operationalization phase, and there's a lot of dependency on the technology. Think of banking and think of healthcare and so forth. That actually there's going to be a need for some of that explainability. It's going to be challenging as well based on deep learning, and I know we're going to see more. I know there's a lot of research coming in terms of building more transparency into the way in which deep learning models operate, and I think that's going to be fascinating to see as well. And then the last tier is this whole area around security, and I think this is something that we're going to see down the road. You mentioned the point on adversarial AI. How do you protect pipelines? How do you protect models? Of course, the infrastructure underneath. So for me, what companies need to now start to think about is embedding some of these areas of governance that are all kind of coming together now. Responsibility, explainability, governance are all kind of coming together into one kind of topic area, not in isolation, and embedding that into the design process, before the first line of code is written, right? I think that's proper quality assurance that companies need to start to think about. And one last piece on that is to think about governance not as something that we've traditionally thought as it slows down innovation or it's a process that's mundane. Think about it, because these systems are so iterative and it's an ongoing process, it's actually the opportunity to fine-tune performance and execution. And it's part of this whole AI assurance and quality that I think is becoming more and more important as well.
Definitely true. Apparently I missed the blue and black memo. I'm just realizing. So sorry, I didn't. Anyways, so one of the things that I wanted to ask Jay about is that a common response that at least I get when people start to explore issues, particularly around unfair bias, is, well, actually we've solved that for ourselves. This is not Google speaking. Instead we just don't measure things like race or gender or any of the sensitive subcharacteristics. And so then problem solved, we're good. How would you respond to that as an approach?
I think that's a very risky proposition to take. Right? I mean,
I'm glad to hear you say that.
even in absence of AI and machine learning, there are plenty of societal examples globally on kind of not measuring these characteristics, not leading to fair outcomes in a grand scheme of things. And that's because with any system, whether it's run by human decision making or data-driven kind of assisted decision making, there are always surrogate features, correlated things that will effectively start to correlate with things that you are not measuring, right? And could then become factors through which bias starts to creep into the system. Again, as I was saying earlier, I think the opportunity here is that if we do measure these things, we now have an opportunity to actually be rigorous against these characteristics in terms of truly measuring how biased these systems are and having mathematical ways of controlling that bias, eliminating it, as the goal of the system. And this doesn't have to happen in the overall notion of, sometimes when I hear this debate, it ends up as, are we implicitly going to a quota system, right? Is that what fairness is about? And actually it's not. The kinds of fairness control that these algorithms will gradually start to deliver, we're already seeing the first wave of those, is, for example, ensuring that the behavior of a machine learning model, that its quality is sustained across these characteristics. So not enforcing a precise quota or distribution on the outcomes, but enforcing a quality bar that stays consistent and is uncorrelated with these sensitive characteristics. That starts to say that kind of every data point, every decision, whatever be the context, is treated with the equal amount of kind of accuracy in the system, right? Which is a very different control than trying to enforce quota level policies, right? So I think as this field evolves, more and more of these granular controls will start to show up. And I think this is where there are opportunities, where if we have a conversation on responsible AI ethics and the algorithms going hand in hand, I think we have a new road to pave that can actually be really beneficial for society.
And so sort of extending from that, if you had to name one thing in fairness research or any of the ML fairness work that you've seen that you're most excited about, what would that one thing be that's coming down the pike?
Let me maybe name two.
Okay.
One that is kind of already here in terms of the pipeline, people who are building these systems could use it today, and one that's kind of coming more from the research phase. I really like the research that deals with post hoc calibration of machine learning models with regards to fairness outcomes. So this is where, imagine you're building some machine learning model for prediction, and you want to ensure that its predictiveness, the predictive accuracy and calibration isn't correlated to some sensitive characteristics you're measuring. There are several algorithms out there now, fairly stable, where you can take a pre-trained model and a bunch of data with these characteristics labeled and recalibrate that model so that it performs fairly and fairness as measured by the definition I gave earlier across this. So this means that, even if the way in which you went about building the model had some biases creep in, like to the extent your population is well represented, you can undo those biases through a calibration process later on, right? Which means that it's a lightweight way of anyone building these ML systems to get on this exercise, right, as a first step, and then move up from there. So that's on the ready side. What I'm really excited about on the research side is some early work at the intersection of fairness and semi-supervised learning, where typically the hardest part about building these systems is getting data labeled across these sensitive characteristics. And the amount of that data typically is what holds us back in how good a system we could build. There is early work that shows that a combination of little bit of labeling and massive amounts of unlabeled data, we can start to get at outcomes that are very similar to having large amounts of data labeled. Right? And as those algorithms get more mature, I think we are going to see the next wave of fairness-based work show up.
So just to wrap up here, so David, you spoke about HSBC writing its own AI principles, and I'd love to hear from you. What would you say to organizations? Presumably, there's organizations in this room who are embarking on this process for themselves. Lessons learned, things that you would suggest not doing more of. any of those things. And Nick, I'd love for you to chime in on this as well from your experience.
Okay, thank you. So I think the first thing we've already said, don't write the decision tree. That does
Yeah,
not exist.
don't do
It
that.
will not exist. I think the best advice I can give is probably embrace respect and humility. And what I mean by that is that this is a multidisciplinary exercise. So to come up with our principles, we engage people from the technology team, from the legal team, from the communications team, from the people who thought about customer outcomes, from our risk team, from our compliance guys, because at the end of the day, the regulations we comply with are really there to protect customers and protect the integrity of the financial system we operate. So we try to treat this as a multidisciplinary exercise, not just a technology exercise, not just a business exercise, not just a legal exercise or compliance exercise. And we all try to turn up to develop the principles with respect for the other people's expertise and self-respect for our own expertise, because we're all turning up as experts, but also humility in the face of the other expertise that people had to show. So I think that's the right way to approach it. And then I think the other thought is anything you come up with is a start point, not an end point. And you need, as you design your iteration of that and your application of that, you need to build in the continuous recalibration of the principles, because as I said earlier, humans are slow to develop the ethical instincts they need to respond to new technology. This is a conscious exercise to try and accelerate, but we won't always get it right.
I come back to what you highlighted at the beginning, and for me, and what I'm seeing is that companies now are paying much more attention to build a trust into systems. And when we see when we survey companies, and we actually when we survey employees, independent of senior IT leaders, the biggest barrier that employees say, this is from an enterprise point of view, not necessarily a consumer adoption point of view, but from a business enterprise point of view, the biggest barrier they have with AI in the workplace and the enterprise is trust. I mean, they just do not fundamentally understand or have an understanding of the where their privacy comes into play, or with the accuracy of these systems, how is it going to improve their life, etc. So getting adoption is a really important one, and trust is a key part of that. So I think part of it is to start to consider these processes and this topic, right in the design phase. The challenge that companies could have had without doing this is that they have to approach it afterwards, and I think that could be. Those problems will get exacerbated because this technology moves so fast if you don't do it in the design phase. So that would be my main recommendation.
We are over time. Thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.